Hello, I am Chris Swinford, the pulpit minister of the Faith Village Church of Christ here in Wichita Falls. We're certainly excited that you've joined us for our time of Bible study today. I know a lot of you are locked up in your houses because of the winter weather, and maybe this will be a good diversion. Maybe this will be a great time to focus on God and His Word as we study together. We've been studying together the Psalms of Ascent, Psalm 120 through Psalm 134. These were psalms that the Jews sang as they prepared their minds for worship, as they prepared to go to the temple and worship God together. And these can certainly help us as we prepare for times of worship here ourselves. Just imagine people from all over the country, even from faraway countries. We read in Acts chapter 8 about the Ethiopian eunuch who came to the temple to worship. Think about all of those from all over traveling to Mount Zion, traveling to Jerusalem, traveling to the temple, and preparing their minds. Well, while they would come, they would sing these psalms to help get their mind ready for worship. And then as they would come into Jerusalem, they would join together with other worshipers and they would sing these songs together as they would go up the steps, as they would climb up through Jerusalem towards the temple. And as they approached the temple, you would just hear families and people from all over the known world singing these psalms together. These psalms focused them. It got their attitude right. It got them to focus on God and having their sins forgiven and on worshiping Him. I think certainly today we need to focus our minds and make sure we have the right attitude as we approach a time of study like this, but especially as we approach times of worship together. These psalms ought to impact us. Too many times we come sliding into the pew right as things are starting, and we haven't had time to focus our mind. We want to always make sure we have that time together. We need to look at 4 Psalms of Ascent today. Psalm 127, 128, 129, and 130. We've already studied 6 of the Psalms of Ascent together. Now we'll start with this 4. The first 2 psalms we're going to look at are songs of ascent that would be sung celebrating the blessings of having a faithful family. These psalms would be sung by families who were going to worship together, or by people who would meet family on the road or in Jerusalem or even at the temple and worship together. Let's read the first of these together. It's Psalm 127, and this is a psalm of Solomon, David's son. It says, "Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives to his beloved sleep. Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows in the hands of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gates." This is one of my favorite psalms. I really appreciate this, and I can just imagine having my family, my extended family around me, my parents, my children, my grandchildren, my sister and her family, all of us gathered together singing a song and how blessed it is to have a family as we go to worship together. As they approached Jerusalem, they would sing of how God blesses them through generations of family members, and how worship is an activity that joined generations of family members together through time. The first thing that I notice as I listen to this psalm, as I read it aloud and listen to what it says, is that the psalmist Solomon knows that God is ultimately the one that keeps our homes and our communities strong. The security of the home and community aren't based on the builders. They're not based on the watchmen. They're based on God. Solomon grew up in the family of King David. Now, that may sound like a great thing, but the family of King David was really a pretty tragic family situation. You even had a brother who raped a sister. You had brothers and sisters who would be attacking each other. One brother kills another brother, and one brother tries to take over the throne from your father. It was a real soap opera. But Solomon sees the blessings of family as well. He loved his father David. As he talks about him in the Proverbs, we read of how he lived according to the words that his father passed on to him. And he knows the strength and power that comes from family. And Solomon had a really large family himself. But as he wrote this psalm, he was thinking about how it's God that makes the difference. When you forget God, things go wrong. When you remember God, things go right. And it's not about just about the people involved, it's about the God behind everything. In the Songs of Ascent, they sing of how God blesses them with families and how God sustains them and sustains their family. I need to remember this. And I need to remember that God is the one who holds our family together. Sometimes we think maybe it's us or maybe it's someone else in the family. Growing up, I always thought it was my mother that sort of held everything together. But we need to see beyond those things. Just as last week we talked about seeing beyond the authorities and all that reign over us, we need to look up to the throne room and see that God is the one in charge. This is true also inside our family situations. God is the one in charge. The second thing that I hear as I listen to this psalm, as I read it to myself, is the psalmist Solomon says that we wake up early and stay up late, and we're anxious as we eat our meals. But trusting in God allows us to sleep. Too many times I try to take everything into my hands. I try to fix things. I try to make things work. I try to manage my family, manage my situations. But we need to realize that we must turn things over to God. That we will never be able to rest if we put all that on ourselves, because we're not capable of managing everything. But we need to give it to God. And when we give it to God, we find ourselves able to rest. As they walked up to worship, they would sing about how it was so foolish to spend your days and nights being anxious. Your days and nights worried about what was going to happen. Your days and nights trying to plan and figure out how you were going to manage and control things. All these things were foolishness. It's trusting in God that enables you to have peace. Knowing that God is there to help you and your family gives you great peace. Jesus talked about this in the Sermon on the Mount. Birds and the lilies of the field, they're not worried. They know that God takes care of them. They're still putting out roots and still going to find materials for their nest, but they trust that God will take care of them, so they are not anxious about the day. We need to learn from that. We need to also not be anxious knowing that God is taking care of things. The third thing that I hear as I'm listening to this psalm is that the psalmist Solomon says that children are a gift from God. They're like arrows, and you're blessed to have a quiver full of them. I'm talking to you today from our home, and I wish I could just take the camera with me and walk around and show you all the pictures of our family that we have here inside our home. We realize that they're a great blessing. We need to always remember it's a great blessing from God to us. As they went up to worship, they had their children all around them. Children running around, talking to other ones, asking questions, running around. I'm sure there were a lot of parents yelling, "Get back here," the whole time, as they were surrounded by generations of family members, generations of children. They would sing of how God has blessed them with those children and how God has blessed them with the generations that they walk beside. I certainly love my family, and I'm certainly glad for the blessing of it. Everything isn't perfect, but I'm so grateful for the blessing of having family, for the blessing of having children in the family. And I need to realize that is a gift that comes from God. Also, as I listen to the psalm, the fourth thing that I hear Solomon saying is, he says that children give you something to boast about as you grow older, as you speak in the gate. Now, those of you that know me well, or even those of you who just heard me speak, you know that I have no problem bragging about my grandchildren. I have no problem bragging about my sons. I love my family, and I'm more than happy to speak in the gate, as it was said. Speak in the gate was a Hebraism meaning to talk to others with pride, or talk to others as you get older and as you're sharing the stories of what's happened. I love to share stories. I love to tell stories from different places I've been, different things I've done. But more than anything, I like to tell stories of the family. And Solomon says that when you're older, when it's your turn to sit as a man in the gate, you'll have these stories with you. And they would sing of how children and future generations bless us in special ways. But one thing is, they comfort us in our old age and they give us something to talk about. When I was a father, somebody would say, "Do you have a picture of your kid?" And I would say, "Well, yeah, here's one. This is of Alan. This one's of Daniel," different things like that. But now, if you say, "Do you have a picture of Gavin or Kieran or Josiah?" Oh, I have thousands. I have so many pictures. And I am more than happy to spend the whole day showing you them. I need to realize what a blessing it is from God to have a family, to have children still there that I can talk about and boast about in the gate. Now let's look at Psalm number 128. We're going to bring about some points that we need to use to apply to our lives a little later. So we'll come back to Psalm 127, but let's read Psalm 128 together. We don't know who wrote this psalm, but this psalm is an incredible blessing when it comes to talking about how God blesses us through family. It says, "Blessed is everyone who fears the Lord, who walks in his ways. You shall eat the fruit of the labor of your hands, and you shall be blessed, and it shall be well with you. Your wife will be like a fruitful vine within your house. Your children will be like olive shoots around your table. Behold, thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord. The Lord bless you from Zion. May you see the prosperity of Jerusalem all the days of your life. May you see your children's children. Peace be upon Israel." As they would approach Jerusalem, they would sing of how God blesses their family and blesses future generations through faithfulness. If you're faithful to Him, you're blessed according to that faithfulness. He talks about some very specific things. He talks about having a fruitful wife, a healthy wife, a prosperous wife, and one who is able to give children around your house. He talks about children as olive shoots that grow up. Like the olive tree grew up so quickly, so our children grow up quickly as well. And as they approached Jerusalem, they would sing about this, about how having a family in the home is such a blessing. Now, I know not everyone has this. Not everyone has kids running around their feet and all those things. That's why I'm glad that as we walk to Jerusalem, we interact with other families and we're able to share this joy of family with our church family as well. As the Jews came, their families mingled. And as we come to worship, our families mingle as well. And I'm grateful for that. As we listen to this psalm, the first thing that I hear the psalmist saying to us is that every person who fears the Lord and walks God's way will be blessed. There's so many different ways in which we might be blessed. One of these is the family, but there are other ways as well. But if you are fearing the Lord and walking with Him, you will be blessed mightily. Blessedness does not come from luck. It comes as a gift from God. It doesn't come from coincidence or circumstance. It's all God's gift when we're blessed. Those who respect God and walk the way God demands, they tend to find these blessings in life. And I know that you've experienced that. The second thing I hear as we listen to this psalm is the psalmist telling them that God will bless the work of their hands and that things will go well with the faithful. God blesses those who listen to Him and who follow Him. When I think about this, I think about people like Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were faithful, and so they were blessed. Towards the end of Daniel chapter 1, it says, because they were willing to follow and obey God, God blessed them in great ways, and Daniel even in a special way. We need to remember this is how God works. God's faithful and will bless us as we are faithful to Him and work for Him in this life. It doesn't mean He will give us great wealth or great health, but He will bless us in incredible ways. Ephesians chapter 1 talks about how we receive every spiritual blessing when we're in Christ. We need to realize how valuable it is to have grace, mercy, love, peace, forgiveness, joy. all the great spiritual things of God, the grace and the mercy that He offers, the forgiveness that He gives. We need to remember that we receive these things as we are faithful to God. We aren't to sit and wait for blessings. We are to actively live a life for God, put effort and work into what we do. When we are working for God, we're going to be blessed by God. Listening to the psalm, I also hear another thing. The third thing I hear is the psalmist saying that God will bless your family with good health. He says the wife will be healthy like a fruitful vine, and the children will spring up like olive shoots around your table. The first time I read this, I thought it meant you would just have a whole lot of children. Your wife would be very fruitful, have lots of kids, and you would have all these kids growing up around you. But as I did my word study in the Hebrew, I noticed that the word that it uses for the woman is actually one filled with health and able to be fruitful in more ways than just bearing children, but healthy and able to bless the life of those inside the home. And then the children growing up speaks to speed. They grow up so quickly. And that's certainly something that those of us who have seen kids grow up and are now seeing grandkids grow up, we understand is that the years go by so fast. And we need to embrace them as we go. I was telling my dad the other day about how fast time goes now that I'm a grandfather. And he just looked at me and rolled his eyes and said, "You just don't know anything yet." And it reminded me that's the same thing that happened when I talked about having children. I said, now that I've got our sons, time goes so fast. And he rolled his eyes and thought, "You don't know anything yet." I think time just keeps speeding up. But as we grow up, those kids, they seem to grow up faster and faster all the time. We really need to hold on to them while we have them. This is not just an individual blessing. If you are faithful and work for God and live God's way, God will bless your family. He'll bless all your family, especially those faithful in walking the way that He walked. To the Jews, the blessing of fertility was so important. We see that in the story of Hannah and Samuel and Abraham and Sarah, families that were looking for offspring. This is one great way the faithful may be blessed, the ability to have children. But we know that some who aren't fertile, as far as we think of it medically, they're still blessed to be able to have family, to have children, just different ways. We must embrace the families that we've been blessed to have. As we continue listening to the psalm, fourth, the psalmist prays that Israel, Zion, and Jerusalem will be blessed with peace so that worship can continue. They prayed that their nation would continue to be strong so that they could worship, that their mountain continued to be strong so they could worship, that their city be strong and godly so that they could worship. We need to think about the implications for that today. As they prayed about how they wanted their Jewish nation, the land around them, their city, to be faithful and right and filled with peace so that they could worship in peace, we also need to be praying that we can worship in peace today. We need to be praying for our country, for the leaders of this nation. We need to be praying for our state. We need to be praying for the leaders here. We need to be praying for our community, in this case for Texoma and for Wichita Falls. We need to be praying for the leaders here. And we need to be praying for our church leaders as they help create an environment where we can worship peacefully. I don't know of a congregation that's always had every day peaceful, but I do know that with focus and with work, you can create that peaceful place that's a true blessing and helps you to worship in a beautiful, wonderful way. And that's my prayer. That's my hope, is that we will always provide such a place here. And I am so grateful to live in a country that enables me to worship freely. And we should all take that to heart. The fifth thing is that I hear when I read the psalm, listen to the psalmist prays for longevity and that you may see your children's children. In Psalm 128, he makes it so clear that he wants us to live long enough to see our family unfold. But it's more than that. He wants us to live long enough to pass on our wisdom and our understanding and our godliness so our family will be faithful. Malachi chapter 2, he tells us why he doesn't want or like divorce. It's because his main goal is the faithful next generation. He wants another faithful generation of children. And that is his hope for us, that if he gives us longevity, we will help raise another faithful generation. So those two psalms dealt more with family. The next two psalms are psalms of ascent that would be sung during really hard times, during times of struggle in the nation, and times of struggle as individuals. Let's read Psalm 129 together and see this psalm that they sang when their nation was having trouble. Psalm 129 begins, Greatly have they afflicted me from my youth, let Israel now say. Greatly have they afflicted me from my youth, yet they have not prevailed against me. The plowers plowed upon my back, and they made long their furrows. The Lord is righteous. He has cut the cords of the wicked. May all who hate Zion be put to shame and turn backward. Let them be like the grass on the housetops, which withers before it grows up, with which the reaper does not fill his hand, nor the binder of sheaves his arm. Nor do those who pass by say, The blessing of the Lord will be upon you. We bless you in the name of the Lord. As they approached Jerusalem, they sang this psalm of ascent, and you can tell instantly it's very different. It's for walking to worship when times are difficult and hard, during a time when other nations threaten your ability to worship. It's about worshiping during times of captivity, during times of enslavement. It's about worshiping during the hardest times in the Jewish nation. As we listen to the psalmist says first that since his youth, it's been a struggle to physically go up to worship, but it hadn't stopped him. Since his youth, he has had to struggle to go to those times. Now, living in Ukraine, I was in a situation where we got to see this and understand this. I had already moved back, but when the Russians overtook the area of Donetsk and the Donbass region, one of the things they did was threaten Christians as they worshiped, telling them they shouldn't worship anymore. And as an American, I found that to be incredible that was happening. And yet in an overall world context, it's not so amazing. It's actually more typical. There are times when going to worship is going to be hard. Our challenge may be snow on Sunday, but there are people that face incredible challenges as they worship. I have friends in places like Cairo, Egypt, and they live in Israel and other places, and they face real challenges just worshiping on a day-to-day basis. The psalmist understands. There are times where it's just even hard to get to worship. Times like this can make worship even more sweet and even more important to us. The second thing that I hear as we listen to this psalm is the psalmist speaking of times of enslavement by another nation. He even speaks of the scars on his back that had been plowed there as he was beaten because of who he was. And he's talking still about how hard it is to worship during these times. I can't imagine having a beating like that. I can't imagine being whipped and having huge scars on my back. But there are times when we are hurt or wronged, and it doesn't mean we can't worship God. It means that we need to worship Him even more. When I think back to, in our history, things that have happened among the slaves and things that have happened among the Native Americans and other times, there have been times when people have been so rudely and horribly treated. And it almost seems like without fail, it made them more spiritual and reaching out more to God. I pray that we personally don't go through this kind of suffering of being enslaved and beaten, but it should draw us to worship. It should draw us towards God. And the psalmist has this heart as he talks about this himself. Third thing that I see as we listen to this psalm is the psalmist says that the Lord was kind and remembered them in their distress. He cut the cords that bound them. It's just like when God heard the children of Israel in Egypt. when they were enslaved. Throughout times, the nation of Israel had been enslaved many different times in many different ways, most notably during the time of Christ by the Roman Empire. During these times, God hears and God will deliver. And we must have a heart for worship, because worship is when we call out to God. Worship is when we reach out to God. During these times, God will hear and He'll cut those cords and He will deliver us. The fourth thing I hear as I listen to this psalm is the psalmist remembers times where there was no good harvest. The grain would fall before being harvested, and there wasn't even enough grain to carry. Now, this is something that I understand better. During times where the grain would be on the stalk and we would have a hailstorm or we would have a giant windstorm and it would destroy a crop, you would see people beaten down with the fact that there wasn't going to be a harvest that year. And as someone in our family, we had a grain elevator. We depended on farmers having grain. So as they struggled, it was also our struggle growing up. Much of the worship of the Jews was centered around times of harvest. It's certainly a picture that Jesus used, but it's also part of their calendar. Times like Pentecost were meant to be built around a good harvest, a harvest they could celebrate. But there were times when the harvest wasn't successful, when you went out and cut the wheat, but there was no head of wheat, or at least not much to speak of. It was all just leaf. It was all just plant and not grain. There were times where there was nothing left in the field. During these times of unsuccessful harvest, it's time to worship God anyway. Worship Him again in view of the next harvest. The fifth thing I see as I listen to this psalm is he reminds them of how when during the time of harvest they would say, God has blessed us, depending on the harvest. So during good harvest, they would say, God has blessed us. During bad ones, they wouldn't say this. The implication is for us that we always thank God for the harvest. Big or small, we always thank God. There are times where you don't feel positive. There are times where you're frustrated with how things are going. We just need to remember to turn to the God who can change things. Turn to the God who can give us a good harvest, the one who can bless us again. Well, that's talking about a time of national struggle. Psalm 130 talks about a time of individual struggle. In Psalm 130, the psalmist says, and again, we don't know the psalmist for this one, it's anonymous, but the psalmist says, out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. O Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my pleas for mercy. If you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, O Lord, who could stand? But with you there is forgiveness, that you may be feared. I wait for the Lord. My soul waits, and in His word I hope. My soul waits for the Lord more than watchmen for the morning. More than watchmen for the morning, O Israel, hope in the Lord. For with the Lord there is steadfast love, and with Him is plentiful redemption. And He will redeem Israel from all his iniquities. Now, most people, most scholars who write on the Psalms believe this is a Psalm of David. It just doesn't carry his name with it. It sounds just like other Psalms that David did write, and it addresses a theme that David touches on many times in the Psalms, and that is of personal sin and how God offers forgiveness. But the text doesn't say, so we're not going to make that assumption, as obvious as it may seem to us. As they approached Jerusalem, they would sing of how God rescues and delivers them during times of sin, individual or family sin. This was a song of ascent for those offering up sin and guilt sacrifices. Some people, as they were traveling to worship, were carrying livestock with them for the purpose of having their sin forgiven, of offering those sacrifices. In fact, I would say nearly everyone had livestock with them as they went. Now, we know during the time of Christ that they began selling livestock there, so your livestock didn't have to make this giant trip. That really makes null and void the idea of sacrificing. Anything that you don't carry with you, anything that's not yours that you give up, is not truly, by definition, a sacrifice. And that's why Jesus was so upset with this practice. But they would come bringing their sacrifices as they came and they sang so that they could find forgiveness from God. As we listen to this psalm, the first thing we notice is he sings about how he would cry out to God when he was in sin and how he knew God would hear his voice. When we've sinned, we shouldn't hide it from God. We should cry out to God. We should tell God. He knows anyway, and he's the only one who can help us. Hiding it from God is hiding it from the one person who could redeem us and save us, forgive us. So we certainly need to always come clean before God. The second thing I see as we listen to this psalm is the psalmist says that if God were to write out every sin that we've committed, it would be much more than we could ever bear or handle. Just imagine that. Imagine that if there was a list and you went out to the mailbox and there was this giant package and in it was a list of every sin you have committed. We've all sinned so many times. It grieves us, and I can't imagine seeing all of my sins at one time. But it would underline the fact that we ourselves cannot handle our sin. We cannot forgive our sin. We cannot deal with our sin. We cannot manage our sin. We're going to have to give it to God because only God can do that. Third thing I see as I listen to this psalm is the psalmist says that even in sin, he looks forward to being in God's presence because of his mercy. He waits for him just as he would the watchman of the morning. This is another reason that many scholars believe David wrote this, because the watchman would especially be noticeable walking around the palace. And they sort of let you know that you are secure and that everything's okay. The psalmist looked forward to God's presence to take care of him, just as he would those watchmen. Watchmen walking about in the morning reminds you that you came safely through the night. The psalmist looks forward to worship with God, and he's grateful that God protects him, and he looks forward to receiving forgiveness again and worshiping again. The fourth thing we see as we listen to this psalm is the psalmist says that God has unconditional love and more than enough redemption for his children. I love this part of the psalm. His love for us is unconditional. And God is able to redeem us no matter how long the list of sins that we have. You know, when we talked about having that list of sins, that's overbearing. It's too much for us to handle, thinking about all of our sins together. But what a blessing it is to think about how God is able to redeem us from that list. And so imagine that list being in front of you, and imagine that over each of those was written in blood the word redeemed. Bought back with a price. That's the story of our salvation. And the psalmist wants us to know that if we seek this forgiveness from God, we can receive it. Here's a few lessons that we should learn. The first one is, if the Lord's not with us, it doesn't matter how hard we try. We're going to fail. If the Lord's with us, we will find success. But if he's not, despite what we do, we will not succeed. Our success and security is based on the presence of God. And this is something we celebrate in worship. If God is with us, who can be against us? If the Lord was not with us, we would fail. And so we celebrate that as we worship. The second lesson that we learn is that God blesses us through our children, our grandchildren, and our future generations. They're what carry us on in our old age. What a blessing it is to be surrounded by children and grandchildren, to have people going ahead of us, following in our history as they line up behind us and live for God in yet another generation, teach for God in yet another generation. This is what gives us strength and joy in our old age. Third lesson we learn is that God blesses us as we work. He blesses us through bringing peace and blessings to our family as we worship him. As we work on being godly, God works on blessing us. And that's certainly a lesson we need to remember. The fourth, sometimes it's hard in a nation. Sometimes there are hard times that we face as a community. Sometimes there's hard times that we face in a group of people. Sometimes our harvest isn't good. We need to praise God anyway, because the hope for the next harvest the hope for our deliverance, the hope for our redemption is all found in God. And then, lastly, number 5, worshipers are sinners in need of love, forgiveness, and redemption. And we only find that in God. And we must worship God. We must love God. We must work for God, be loyal to God, because He is the one that can write redeemed over our sins in blood. He's the one that can show us that redemption. He's the one that can make all the difference, and that is why we come together and we worship Him. This is what they were thinking about as they were singing together, walking to worship, walking through the nation of Israel, walking up Mount Zion, walking into Jerusalem, walking up to the temple. These were 4 of the songs they sang, 4 of the things they had on their mind. I really love these Psalms of Ascent because they remind me of where my head ought to be at when I come together with God's people, of things that I need to be thankful for, like the gift of family and the gift of forgiveness and the gift of deliverance. These Psalms of Ascent call us to worship God, not because everything's great, but because we need God, and we need to sing beside God's people with one voice, letting God know what we need. I look forward in next week to studying more of these Psalms with you, more of these Psalms of Ascent. And as we continue to go through the study of the book of Psalms, I want you to know it's been such a great personal blessing to me, and I pray that it's been a blessing to you as well. I pray God's blessings on you. I pray that God will bless you as we go through the rest of this week. I pray that God will bless you as we meet together for worship on Sunday. And I pray that as we come together to worship, we will realize the great blessing that we have in Christ Jesus, and that we will celebrate that together. May God bless you through this week. May God bless you in the days and weeks to come.